Good evening, everyone. We're just about ready to begin. My name is Bridgette Baker, and I'll be your producer for this evening's event. Before we get started, I do have a few housekeeping items to review. This evening's webinar is being recorded and broadcast live on Facebook, so feel free to invite your social media friends to join in or start a watch party and invite others to join. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll find the Q&A button. And although we won't be answering your questions in real time tonight, please do feel free to use the Q&A button throughout the presentation to pose your questions, and we will address as many as we can, time permitting. On the bottom towards the right, you'll find the chat function, and we highly encourage you to use the chat to express your thoughts on the topics that we'll discuss tonight. This evening's discussion forum was designed for you after all, so we do encourage you to remain attentive and participate as much as possible via the chat and Q&A functions. I thank you for your attention during our housekeeping review. I now hand the floor over to Sarita Tinsley, National First Vice President for the National Coalition of 100 Black Women, Inc.
Good evening, everyone. It is truly my pleasure to introduce my president, our president. Virginia W. Harris was re-elected president of the National Coalition of 100 Black Women, Inc. for a second term at the 19th Biennial Conference, October the 12th, 2019 in Atlanta, Georgia. She has demonstrated her leadership abilities through successfully serving at both the national and local chapter levels. For the past 17 years, she has served as national president, first vice president of programs, vice president of finance and fund development, national treasurer, and chaired several national committees. President Harris regularly participates in the National Urban League's BEEP program, lecturing at historical Black colleges and universities. Her stellar work and staunch commitment has earned her numerous national, regional, state, and local awards. Virginia W. Harris.
Good evening. It is my honor to bring greetings on behalf of the National Directorate and all of the activist women in our 61 chapters in 27 states that comprise the National Coalition of 100 Black Women. As you are aware, our conversation today is focused on gun control. We know the problem. What are the solutions? The power of knowledge is everything. Staying informed allows us not only to stay aware, but to take preventive action. By knowing the problems, we can start to build the solution. It is critical that we are well informed about issues that affect the health and safety of our families and communities. The CDC reported around 38,000 Americans die from gun violence every year. This is an average of 100 people dying a day by firearm. Gun safety has been and will continue to be a prevalent issue in America if we do not make serious changes. And if we want to be a part of the change, we need to make sure that we are part of the conversation. To the panelists and Congresswoman Lucy McBath, thank you for sharing your time and your knowledge to help create the conversation.
Greetings. I am Mariko Bennett, and it is my honor to introduce our moderator for this evening. Dr. Felicia Phillips is a master business strategist and CEO of PPICW Incorporated. She is a 30-year entrepreneur, supplier diversity and inclusion advocate for small and diverse businesses, and she's also the chair for NCBW's President's Corporate Advisory Board. Dr. Phillips.
Thank you. I am honored this evening to introduce to you our distinguished panelists. Beverly Evans Smith, National President and CEO for Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Beverly Evans Smith is the 2017 to 2021 National President and CEO for Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, one of the nation's largest female-owned and operated public service nonprofits. She is also a national honorary member of the National Coalition of 100 Black Women. Smith served as the 2015 to 2017 chair of the National Association of State Directors of Adult Education and has testified before the U.S. Senate Help Committee representing the issues faced by adults with literacy challenges. Smith is currently a board member for the Board of Directors of the National Council of Negro Women and the Delta Research and Education Foundation. Next, we have Dr. Kimberly Jeffries Leonard, National President, the Links Incorporated. Dr. Jeffrey Leonard has a lifelong commitment to public service exemplified throughout her successful professional, academic, and civic endeavors. She is currently the 17th National President of the Links Incorporated and the Links Foundation Incorporated, and serves as Vice President of Administration and member of the Board of Directors of the Black Women's Agenda Incorporated. Most recently, Mayor Bowser appointed Dr. Jeffries Leonard to serve on the Reopen DC Advisory Group and the Reopen DC Task Force on Equity, Disparity, Reduction, and Vulnerable Population Subcommittee to reopen Washington, DC in a way that is safe and sustainable in response to the coronavirus 2019 pandemic. And yes, we have Congresswoman Lucy McBath, NCBW U.S. Representative for Georgia's 6th Congressional District. Congresswoman Lucy McBath is a mother, a wife, an author, and an activist, but most important title she will ever hold is Jordan's mom. McBath spent 30 years working for Delta Airlines as a flight attendant until the death of her 17-year-old son, Jordan Davis, in 2012. Jordan was shot and killed in what became known as the Loud Music shooting. A two-time breast cancer survivor, Representative McBath knows how important it is to protect those with pre-existing conditions and ensure all Americans have access to quality, affordable care. Since taking her oath of office in January of 2019, McBath has sought bipartisan solutions to end gun violence, uplift small business and our economy, protect and serve our nation's veterans, and lower the cost of healthcare and prescription drugs. We will now hear Congresswoman Lucy McBath share her story and talk about why gun control is necessary, followed by Serenity Bryce, NCBW National Intern, as she represents Voices of the Future. After Serenity, we will have a discussion amongst the panelists on gun control. We know the problems. What are the solutions? Congresswoman McBath.
Well, thank you so very much. And I am so honored to be with all of you beautiful women today. Thank you so much to the National Coalition of 100 Black Women and NCBW, Madam President Virginia Harris, and of course, First Vice President Saritha Tinsley, and also to Mariko Bennett, and also to Sherry Stone. And I'm so excited to be a panelist with my own Madam President, Beverly Smith, and then of course, Madam President Kimberly Leonard. Thank you so much for having me here today. And this is such a timely discussion for a time such as this. First of all, I just want to continue to thank you for even having this discussion. It's now more important than ever that we talk about gun violence prevention. I want to start off by making something very, very clear to everyone that, we've changed the conversation around gun violence in America within the last few years. The entire dynamics has completely changed. We have, through our own blood, sweat, and tears, just developed an understanding in America that not only has gun violence disproportionately impacted communities of color, which we know it's been doing that for a very long time, it is truly now endangered every community across the nation. And this is important because when we see the real harm of gun violence in our communities, the real toll is on the human life in our own communities, and it's in our streets and it's in our neighborhoods. And, you can acknowledge the pain and the suffering that's caused by gun violence, but we have a lot of work to do to solve it. And I'm so proud to say that we have led that fight on the national level. And I'm so proud to say that there are so many more like me that are coming to Washington to do this very work. But it's not easy work at all. It is not easy. And every single step of the way, there were people that were telling me that we could never win on these issues, that we were never going to be able to make a difference. On the topic of gun violence was too toxic. But ultimately, we stood up, I stood up, and I spoke my truth. And the country is now listening, not only just to me, but to so many others that are really in this fight for gun safety. So for me, as many of you know, that truth was the story of my own son, losing my own son, Jordan, to unnecessary gun violence. And I lost my son in a very racially motivated shooting to a man who was unable to see the value in my son simply because of the color of his skin. And that very deep and racially motivated hate from a man who was empowered by his gun completely changed my life overnight. And I went from being just a regular suburban mom, working for Delta Airlines as a flight attendant, to a mom on a mission overnight, just demanding more from our leaders, demanding more from our community leaders and from our clergy. Why were they all so silent about the numbers of people that continue to die around the country every single day? As it was said earlier, more than 100 people in this country die every single day. Hundreds more are injured from unnecessary gun violence. And our leaders were doing nothing. They were doing nothing about the numbers of tragedies that were happening around the country, and especially for communities of color that continue to be disproportionately affected by unnecessary gun violence. So I began a career in advocacy, but when I saw that our leaders were refusing to take action after the Parkland tragedy, I knew I had to do more. I decided to stand up and run for office myself, to really stand up and represent and protect families like me, people like me in Marietta, Georgia, and throughout the country. And I took a stand and announced my run for Congress because I know that no one wants to be me. And sure enough, just a few months after announcing my candidacy and my run for office, I jumped in late. We were able to beat the NRA-backed opponent who was running for office against me. And she's now running against me for a second time. And in the House, I am proud to have led the effort on federal background checks for all gun sales and closing the Charleston loophole. This is the first time that this legislation has been enacted in decades. I mean, in decades, we have not been able to get to this point. I also fought to get the CDC $50 million that they have been awarded now to study the effects of gun violence, to do the research, collect the data, because the NRA gun lobby had prevented them from doing the research and data to substantiate the need for gun safety in the country. But, we've made strides in Congress, but we have so much more to do. So when hearing my story, I'm asking that the takeaway be this for each and every woman that is on this call today. We can stand up and we can continue to speak out against the senseless gun violence in this country, and we can win. The tides are changing, but we must do more. And it's no secret that we're in a very, very dark time in our country. And it seems as if our leadership is straying further and further away from the people, protecting and serving the people while millions are suffering. So let's stand together and truly make a change together Collectively, we know how strong we are as women of color. We know we have a seat at the table. Now, all we have to do is just take that seat at the table.
Hi, my name is Serenity. I am a proud graduating senior at Clark Atlanta University. I was born in 1999, the same year as the Columbine Massacre. That one life-changing moment was enough to change how schools conducted protocol, but it wasn't enough for Congress to change how we, as a nation, talk about guns. I remember hearing the news blame the video games with the guns, but I do not remember them blaming the accessibility of guns. I remember the new lockdown drills to protect us from gun violence, but I do not remember new laws being created around gun control. I remember how terrified we were as a nation even 5 years later after Columbine. We were scared, we mourned, but then we moved on. 2012, Sandy Hook Elementary School. We were scared, we mourned, we moved on. 2015, the Charleston Massacre. We were scared, we mourned, but then we moved on. The list could go on, but honestly, I don't even remember every mass shooting that I've heard about, because that's how often they are starting to occur. The Gun Violence Archive reported that in 2019 alone, there were more mass shootings that occurred than days in the year. The more normalized it becomes, the less shocked we are. We are becoming desensitized to a culture of gun violence that affects each and every one of us. And we, as young people, are tired. We are tired of mourning men, women, and children that were never meant to be martyrs. We are tired of constantly seeing our lives taken away before we even have a chance to make a change ourselves. We do not want to mourn. We do not want to remember the fallen. We want policies enacted, and we want gun reform. We want background checks, mental health checks, racial bias tests, and required classes for licensees. What we do not want is to move on. Gun violence affects us all. We want to be heard and to be a part of the solutions. You, as leaders, have the power to include us in the decision to make this change happen. If change is hindered during our generation, it is not solely because of us. It is because the leaders of today are not unlocking the doors and allowing us to enter. Madam President Harris, First Vice President Tinsley, thank you for allowing me to represent the voices of the future. Thank you.
And thank you, Serenity, for that amazing message that you've given us. All right. I love the last statement that Serenity gave us. If change is hindered during our generation, it is not solely because of us. It is because leaders today are not unlocking the doors to allow us to enter. That was a very powerful statement. And so I want to begin this discussion that we're having on gun control. And so my first question is for you, Congresswoman McBath. How has gun violence impacted minority communities, and what we can do to bring more awareness to this issue?
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Phillips, for that question. And I think everyone here knows how adversely we have been affected, our communities have been affected. I'll tell you the very first thing that I did after my own son's death, I began speaking up very, very candidly about what was happening around the country, asking questions, because just, several months before, I just watched Trayvon Martin, be killed in Florida, pretty much the same way Jordan had, and his perpetrator also walked away free. Why was this allowing to happen? What were stand your ground laws? What was this gun culture that we were living under? And why had so many people been silent about what was happening around the country? What were our leaders doing about it? Because it was apparent to me that nothing was being done about it. We talked about it in the communities, the families of those that they lost. Those were the only ones in the communities and around the nation that were talking about this horrific public health crisis that we had been experiencing with gun violence. And I quickly learned, of course, through my advocacy that, as we've said over and over again today, that over 100 people in this country die every single day. Hundreds more are injured due to gun violence. And gun violence has, we know, disproportionately affected communities of color for years and years and years. And so we've seen these devastating shootings in our schools, in our movie theaters, and in concert arenas and bars. And so I traveled around the country talking to our clergy, talking to our political leaders, and anyone that would listen to me. I'd spent much time in Washington championing and talking with the very people that are now my colleagues, asking them to do better and to be more conscious and aware about the numbers of people that continue to die around the country, and their accountability and responsibility to prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening, and that we have to speak up. We have to protect our communities. And that's what all of us can do. Every one of us has a stake, because every one of us knows someone somewhere, family members, community members. We know someone who's been affected by gun violence, and we have to hold our leaders accountable for their positions on gun safety. When we go to the polls, we have to make sure that we are exercising our right to choose those that are willing to keep us safe and not put profit over our own public safety. We've got to demand that they protect our communities. I've sponsored legislation which passed the House for universal background checks on all gun sales, also closing the Charleston loophole. I've put forth legislation that will be looked at in the next session, a Federal Extreme Risk Protection Order Act, that makes sure that people that are exhibiting symptoms of being in crisis and they have access to guns, making sure that they're not going to be allowed to have access to those guns as they're exhibiting these signs of crisis. So we've got to lobby our senators. We've got to demand that they move this life-changing and life-saving legislation that is sitting on the desk of Mitch McConnell. And we always have to speak out for what is right. And what I will tell you is that legislators in Washington and around the country need to hear from us, we the people.
I totally agree. We have to speak up. We have to hold our leaders accountable. And my next question is for Beverly Smith. What factors play into gun violence, in your opinion? Did the problem get this huge?
Well, the first thing I'd say, and I think Congresswoman McBath makes a good point, living in crisis is something that has been an issue for us for a long time in our communities, and that crisis leads people to desperation. Desperation in no way, if you just look at what we've done to our economy. And, I hate to say it all goes back to politics, but in some cases it does. When you're not taking care of the things you need to in the communities, when we're not providing equal access, when we put people in a position where they are unemployed and they're not able to get jobs or get help, then they resort to those measures. But is the problem getting bigger? I think it is. And when I look at the past 4 years, let's say, for example, there is a fear factor out there, and it has become okay to do the kinds of things that are happening with that. There is, if you look now, and that fear factor has grown, it's incited fear among all of us. If you look at the subliminal messages that have put us against each other, and those that suddenly pit people against each other that may not have been as extreme before, and that seems to be okay. That fear factor has caused people to try and feel they have to do something to protect themselves and go above and beyond that protection. And it's not a matter of, but what we're talking is a revolution, and that's not what we need to do as a revolution. Protection is one thing. What's happening today is something else. And when leadership speaks words that incite people to feel that they have to fear each other and that they need to protect each other from one another, then you see the cycle happening, and you see the issue getting much, much larger, because even though we say we don't want to do what we hear, you do. your psyche sets you up to suddenly fear people that you might have not before. The desperation we have, especially in this COVID environment, when you're talking about financial and economic issues that people have, the desperation people are seeing. The issue of mental illness has always been a huge factor in terms of guns violence and gun violence, and the fact that we do not have the laws that Congresswoman McBath talks about, and the kind of background checks that we need are critical. And so you're seeing that mental illness is increasing with the depression that's going on right now in the COVID environment. So I think we have set ourselves up for the situation that we're in, and we have to be smart enough to get ourselves out of that situation.
Yes, we do. And you made some very valid points, that fear factor being one of them. That is really affecting our community deeply. And so, Dr. Jeffries Leonard, my question for you is that in light of the Black Lives Matter movement, do you think that law enforcement should look into and possibly reform their own gun control policies? Do you think federally mandated gun control could contribute to eliminating police brutality?
Thank you so much for that question. And I want to say that I'm just so pleased to be able to be a part of this illustrious panel, and am so proud to support the work that is being done in Congress through Congresswoman McBath and the Congressional Black Caucus and other around gun control policies. These policies will certainly help. But when you talk about police brutality, gun control is just one issue. It's not just an issue of guns, but it's a use of force. And when you talk about the level of force that we see and that we see in these police issues, there's a need for training. There's no need to kneel on someone's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. That is not what the police are here to do. And if you look at all of these issues that are now coming to light that we've been looking at over and over and over for years around how our people are being treated by the police, it's not just the guns issue. It is how force plays into training. It is understanding how police officers are trained. President Beverly talked about the issues of mental health, understanding and recognizing those issues, really looking at how our country addresses what police are trained to do when they are in their roles as officers. Police departments require an average of officers to complete 672 hours of basic training before they join the forces. But we have other professions in where they're required to have many more hours before they become certified or brought onto their profession. And so we need to look at how our police officers are trained. We need to look at issues of force. Gun control is one, but there are many broader issues that feed into how our communities, how Black and brown people are treated by the police. Inherent bias, implicit bias, all of these things are really require the appropriate type of training that we should be demanding for police officers and police departments.
I think ongoing training is definitely needed, but you made a great point. It's not just about gun control, but it's about the force and how they're using it within the community, and training can address that. Congresswoman McBath, what advice would you give to families who have been impacted by gun violence?
Well, thank you so much for that question. I can actually tell you there's not a week that goes by that I'm not talking to mothers and victims of unlawful policing, of homicides, who've lost their loved ones. I just had 2 families yesterday that I was speaking to down in Florida, once again, who just lost their sons, their Black sons. And so that pain never, ever, ever goes away. You're able to control it as you move forward in life. And yes, you must move forward. But I will say that, what I say to victims and families is that everyone has their own grieving process. Everyone manages their grief and their tragedy in their own way. And then it must allow themselves to do so. Those different phases of grief and anger and pain. And sometimes you go back into those cycles over and over again. It takes time, lots of time to heal. What I have said to a lot of those families too, some of the cases, of course, they're open. There are no answers. They don't know, who murdered their loved ones. And sometimes the police don't continue to fight on behalf of those victims' families. Oftentimes, if there is Black on Black crime, those police officers sometimes and investigators drop those cases. They don't continue to find answers. But what I acknowledge to those families is that you deserve to have answers. You deserve to have closure. That's part of your healing process. And so you must continue to champion and fight to get the answers that you deserve, but also, in ways that you can. Not everyone, is able to do what I'm able to do, or I'm not able to do what they are, but in your own way, stand and fight in your own way. Try to make change within your own community so that there are no more families and victims like ourselves. We can't ever give up. And a lot of what we can do happens on the state and local level. A lot of the changes happen on the state and local level legislatively. So I always tell people, start there. We'll be working on the federal level, but they've got to be able to champion on the state and local level, and together collectively will make the change that needs so desperately to happen.
Yes, collectively. And you all are giving such great insight. You made a great point. The families are hurting. The community is hurting. We're scared. A lot of emotions are erupting as we see these things happen. And so, Mrs. Smith, my question for you is, how would you present ideas surrounding gun control to those who argue against gun control due to the Second Amendment, which protects the individual's right to keep and bear arms?
Well, Dr. Phillipson, thank you for that question. I think the key word in the question you just asked was control. Nobody is trying to take away the Second Amendment rights. That is not the point. We do live in a world, unfortunately, where you should have the right to protect yourself. It's the control issue that's there in terms of what do you use to protect yourself? Assault rifles is not the way to do it. Machine guns are not the way to do it. If you're looking for personal protection, what is the need for that kind of guns to be on the market? And I think that's the issue in terms of controlling what you do. I thought about this, and I went to, as we were talking, as both Lucy and Kim were talking, I went to an event, was a women's luncheon thingy. And we're sitting at the table, literally talking about gun control and violence and so on. And it suddenly occurred to me as we're having the conversation, out of the 10 or 15 women that were there were only 2 of us that did not have a gun in our purse. And nobody would trust me with one anyway, but I was stunned. And one group, their chapter had even had lessons on a shooting range to make sure they knew how to use what they were doing. That's where, it kind of goes back to that fear factor, but there's a protection there, but they have a right to protect themselves. But what you protect yourself with is one thing. We're not preparing as individuals for a revolution, I hope. What we should be preparing for is personal protection for yourself. And I think the argument I'd have about those who bring that up there is, hey, the intent is not to do away with the rights of an individual to protect themselves. Second Amendment is fine. It's how you do it, the controls we put on it, what we allow ourselves to be engaged in that cause the problems. And I think that's probably the way I would phrase that argument in terms of nothing wrong with the Second Amendment. But what you're using those weapons for, and in those cases, they are weapons of destruction. And that's not what we're about, not what we should be about. I don't think that's what the amendment was about.
Yes, and thank you for your insight, because what most people hear is the word control, and that is where they get stuck. And so, Dr. Jeffries Leonard, with the pandemic and everything else going on in the country, how do we keep the focus on gun safety relevant in this upcoming election?
I think that we have to do like we do anything. We have to continue to voice the issue. I think we have to bring together the organizations that are represented here at the table, other organizations. We're part of President Harris' President Beverly and I are part of Sisters United for Reform, which is a group of 13 Black women organizations, which touches over 5 million women. And you know, when you touch 5 million women, you're touching families, you're touching friends, you're touching beyond that. So the reach is incredible. But we have to keep these issues at the forefront by just continuing to talk about them, continuing to use our voice. I want to thank President Harris for having the vision to bring this up, because we know that what is happening in the middle of a pandemic, gun sales have been on the rise. Why? Because, as I think Beverly said earlier, you know, we've got people stoking that fear within, you know, our communities. People are stoking the fear that really doesn't need to be stoked. So we know that now we're selling more guns, people are buying more guns, and when you see these gun sales go up, you see the firearm violence go up, and we're not just talking about issues around mass shootings, which we in this country have the highest of any other country, but we're talking about issues of domestic violence. When we talk about being in a pandemic now, we're having people quarantined with each other who are victims of domestic violence, and so you see these kinds of issues being brought to being increased. So we as women who are in organizations like this, we who are listening to these this webinar, we have to start keeping this out in the front, because everything connects, everything is connected. When you see increase in domestic violence, you see increase in gun violence, you see these increases in sales. So we just have to keep using our voice to make sure that we are elevating and escalating these issues. We have to continue to let our members in Congress know that these are issues that are important to us. It's unconscionable that as Congresswoman McBath said, that this has been sitting on Majority Leader McConnell's desk for all of these times. Why is it just sitting there? This legislation is important. And so we as a people, we the people, as she said, we have to make sure that they know this is an issue that's important to us. We have to vote, because when we vote, not just in this presidential election, which is critically important to us, but every election, down ballot on up, because these are the people who are putting these policies in place. And so our job as women on this panel, as women who are listening, as women in the communities, we have to keep raising our voice to say, this is an important issue, even right here in this pandemic, even more so.
Conversations like we're having today are so vital to our community, especially. We have to hold our leaders accountable, and each one of you have made a point in that we have to show up for our local elections which are coming up September 29th. We have to show up. And I wanted to ask Congresswoman McBath, it seems as if every time we turn on the television, we see another horrible instance of overt racism in our country. What have you done to speak out and work for change on the specific issue of crime against the Black community?
Thank you so much for that question. I mean, we've lost far too many young Black men and women in this country. I mean, we are losing them. I'm tired of turning on the television every single day. We have been inundated with footage time and time again of all of our Black and brown bodies, you know, just being completely, you know, just eradicated right before our very eyes. And we must act. And so the Congressional Black Caucus, we have done that very thing in Washington, because as you all stated, we are accountable to our community. We are accountable to this nation to keep you healthy and safe. And in the House, I am happy to have been one of the original co-sponsors of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. A piece of legislation that is so long overdue. It's a compilation of pieces of legislation that my colleagues, prior to my even coming to Washington, have been trying to put forth this legislation for years to come, trying to make these changes long before now. This legislation, and of course, there again, where are we waiting for this legislation to be signed into law? But what it does is it increases the accountability of our law enforcement around the country. We've seen a lot of their misconduct. It enhances transparency and data collection, and also reduces discriminatory practices in policing. Also, what it does, and I do have to say this, I have to be very candid, over and over and over again, we know the Republican Party keeps saying defund the police, defund the police. This legislation does not defund the police. What it does, and I'm so sorry, my dog is barking. I'm so sorry. What it does is it invests in our law enforcement. The federal government invests millions of dollars nationally, federally, every single year to law enforcement to make sure that they are doing the best that they can in policing and serving their communities. And that's what this is. It's a reimagining and investing these federal dollars and making sure that they have training. When our law enforcement is working in a community and they come across an individual that is in crisis, they are not behavioral therapists. They should not be dealing with a person that's in crisis as if they are a therapist and using violence against them. So what this is doing is holding them accountable, reinvesting those federal dollars into training to make sure that they are skilled and prepared for these kinds of events, which are happening more and more within our own communities. I specifically, along with my colleagues, Representative Frederica Wilson, Hakeem Jeffries, and Cedric Richmond, we have just passed a coalition, and it's a commission on the social status of Black men and boys that actually, we led this legislation. It is now signed into law. It creates a commission to study the disparities among African Americans, particularly men and boys across the country. This bill has been passed by the House and the Senate. It's signed into law. This commission will be used in the White House. There will be people that are experts on all of the disparities that really hurt Black men and boys across the country. And that is what we will use in this commission as a means to create the policy by which we're helping to strengthen our young Black men and boys across the country. But we got to continue to speak out about these issues so that our leaders are taking the necessary steps to make sure that we're protecting our communities and protecting our young men and women all across America.
Yes, right now, our young men, our boys, our men, period, need to feel that they are being protected. Thank you so much for that. Mrs. Smith, my next question for you is, with so many races going on in the country, how can we ensure that candidates are focused on gun violence prevention as well as other important issues happening around the country?
Kim Leonard said it a couple minutes ago, we have to use the power of our voice and the power of our vote. That is the only way to really resolve this, if you will. It's not the only way to resolve it, but I think one of the things we do is candidates have to know we're serious about this. So even if the candidate that we are pushing for loses, they still need to have felt the power of our voice and our vote. So, if they're on the edge and they need to understand, they're just going to keep hearing from us over and over again, regardless of how this election comes out. Lucy McBath had a point. There still has to be some congressional change. So we're going to have to hold their feet. So McBath as well, but I think we're okay with that. I'm sorry, I threw a sore and I didn't mean to. It's kind of an automatic, but we have to hold legislative feet to the fire. Locally, in the state, in the counties, nationally, they need to see us. It's tough to ignore somebody if you look them in the eye. I used to make sure my daughter's boyfriends always came to the house. My son said, I don't want these guys in here. I said, no. I want them to see my face on a regular basis. So when they're by themselves, the first thing they see when they look at her is my face saying, don't you dare. So it's the same kind of thing. They have to know you. They have to see you. They have to see you sitting in those town hall meetings. They have to feel the power of your voice. They have to see that you're voting and that you're going to vote on a regular basis until you get the change that you need. I said, even for those races that we lose, we need to vote in numbers so we know that power is there. That is truly the only way. And I realize I got off track with the story, but that was on my mind, so forgive me. But we have to make sure that they know who we are, that they see us on a regular basis. We cannot allow those who are in this situation with gun violence supporting it to forget that we're there, or to forget what their lack of action is doing in communities around the country.
Absolutely. You made a very valid point. We can't give up. We cannot get tired. We have to consistently show up over and over again. I think that has happened in the past where we're there for a moment and then we move on to something else, but we have to keep showing up.
That's
now,
right.
Dr. Jeffries Leonard, I'm sorry. Why do you think gun control is such a huge debate in America, whereas in countries like Canada, they have lower reports of gun control due to extensive gun control protocol and licenses?
Well, I think it goes back to what President Beverly said, that, you know, when we talk about gun control here in the United States, people think that we're trying to end their Second Amendment right. We're trying to take away their guns. And I think that's part of the issue. And it's not only what they think, it is the message that is being sent by those who are in power, who have the money to kind of put those messages out there. So when we talk about gun control here, people hear, oh, they're trying to take our rights away, or that's the message that's being conveyed. But we know that there is no other developed country in the world that has the rates of gun violence like we have here in the United States. And so what we know is that when we put laws in place, when we put structured laws in place, countries with structured laws have less gun deaths. Places with the more structured laws have less gun deaths. And those countries like ours, we have more. And so the debate is raging, because while this is a public health issue, as Congresswoman McBath said, you know, and also President Harris, when you look at the numbers, gun deaths are a public health issue. But the issue for those who are opposed to gun control is around economics. You know, money plays a part, and the idea that something is being taken away. That is not the case. There's nothing that is being taken away, and a lot of the issue around the debate is the messaging. Congresswoman McBath told us about the fact that the legislation that we absolutely support, that has the bipartisan legislation, the Police and Justicing Act, it's not about defunding the police. But the messaging is that is what it is about, defunding the police. And so when we talk about this debate, what we have to do is do our homework. We have to look very carefully. We have to look at those, listen to those people who, dare I say it, are really going to tell us the truth and not push forward a position. Do the research for yourself. Get the information out there. See what's in those pieces of legislation, because what is happening here is that things are being driven by political agendas. They're being driven by economics. But the real issue is, our goal should be to reduce gun violence. Our goal should be to reduce the sale of weapons that, as President Beverly said, there's no place for those in a protection environment. And we have to do the work that we need to do to ensure that our communities understand what is in this, to make sure that our congressional representatives understand where we all stand on these issues, so that debate can no longer be the debate, and that the appropriate messaging is out there, because the goal should be the same.
Absolutely. You made a great point that I think we often miss. We have to do our homework. There is going to be a lot of information thrown at all of us, some of it to confuse us. We have to do our homework so that we can be clear about what we're voting for. And this discussion is so timely. Thank you again to the National Coalition of 100 Black Women. As we continue the conversation, I hope that if you're watching, that you are sharing this with your community, because we have to get this information out. My next question for Congresswoman McBath is, considering all the numerous cases of gun violence, examples, Sandy Hook Elementary, the Charleston massacre at Emmanuel African American Episcopal Methodist Church, the El Paso shooting at Walmart. In your opinion, why do you believe no political action or reform was taken against gun violence federally?
Thank you for that question. I will say first and foremost that this gun culture, the gun culture is so expansive, so extreme, and it's been 25, 30, 35 years in the making that there is not just one piece of legislation that is going to solve it all. It is going to take many years of pieces of legislation, various pieces of legislation, as we've talked about even earlier, as you mentioned before, domestic violence, suicide, child access prevention. I mean, red flag laws, background checks, concealed carry reciprocity, open carry, all these pieces of legislation, all of these policies that I'm identifying. It will take years to pass this legislation to really completely change the entire culture, the violent gun culture. And that's the reason why no one wants to talk about it, because it is so expansive and it does take a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of grassroots organizing and movement building, but absolutely it takes a lot of outcry from the public. And I will tell you, I can recall when I was on the Hill, I can recall when I was all over state legislatures, all over the country, advocating, talking to state legislators, talking to our governors, talking to our civic leaders, talking to our federal legislators in Washington, and what they would say over and over and over again to me as well. If this is true, what you say, that over 90% of the American population agrees with you, where are they? We don't hear them. We don't hear from them. And so those representatives are only going to pay heed to those that they hear from. And when you talk about, and it's very apparent, you talk about, that the NRA gun lobby has had so much power and authority, at one time having been the most authoritative and well-funded lobby organization in the country. They've had a lot of power over a lot of years to really stimulate and massage this extremist gun culture that we're living in. And so, when you know that 9 in 10 Americans are supporting the kind of legislation that we're working towards in Washington, but the Senate refuses to pass this legislation, why? Because they've been bought out by the NRA gun lobby, the leadership. And I have to be very careful to say that it's not every NRA card carrying member that is extremist, but it has been the leadership that have been pushing forth this extremist agenda. It is a symbiotic relationship between gun manufacturers and those legislators that are receiving money from the NRA gun lobby and the gun manufacturers. It's a symbiotic relationship. They have become bedfellows. I always say, follow the money. There is nothing but profit being put over the public safety of Americans. And so I believe we got to continue to speak out against the NRA gun lobby. We have done that. We see the fracture that's happening with the NRA gun lobby leadership, all of the truth of who they've become, what they've been doing all these years. But that has been the people. That has been the people standing up and pushing and placing pressure on the NRA gun lobby. Now we've got to continue to do that with our legislators that have been taking the payouts from the NRA gun lobby, putting forth this legislation on the floor and profiting over the public safety of Americans. We can change this, but there again, people must be willing to speak out, and you do that at the polls as well. You go to the polls and you make sure that morally and ethically you are not selecting anyone that has an A+ rating from the NRA gun lobby. They should have an F.
Yes. Powerful, powerful statement. This was a very much needed discussion. I want to thank each of you for sharing your insights, providing clarity to our audience. Thank you again to the National Coalition of 100 Black Women for having us here today to have this discussion on gun control. I'm now turning it over to our Q&A.
Okay, since we have some time permitting, I'm going to go ahead and see what we can pull from the Q&A that we have here. All right, so there are some, there's one question here about what are we doing within our communities specifically in relation to gun crime and gun violence? And I assume that's a question for Congresswoman McBath.
Thank you so much. There have been so many grassroots organizations, gun violence prevention organizations and groups within our communities all around the country. They've always been there, but they've been understaffed and underfunded. Those are the ones that you don't hear about. Right within our own communities, the minority community, we've always had them there. But there again, they're understaffed and underfunded. So I have always been advocating to people that a way to really get started is to look within your own community. Those organizations are there. And just really try to tap in, volunteer, really start there, because most of the change legislatively, most of the change that happens with gun violence prevention, that happens much more expediently, much more quickly, happens on the state and local level. It takes a little bit longer for the federal law to come into place. As you can see how long it's taken for us to have any kind of change with background checks, closing the Charleston loophole, all of those things. That takes usually a long time to happen. But I would say on the federal level, those organizations are there. There are a lot of organizations for victims like myself. And I would truly encourage everyone here, tap into those organizations, because a lot of those groups have great insight as to the laws within the states, those respective states. They have a lot of information and about resources and tools that can be used within those communities, within your own communities. And I would really advocate that you make sure within your own states that whenever there is gun legislation that comes to the state legislature, you need to be there in numbers in those hearing rooms. You need to be there, because for many, many years, the NRA gun lobby was outshining us. They were there in numbers. The tides are changing, but you have to physically be calling those state and local leaders, calling their offices, rallying, showing up to their offices, making sure whenever there are hearings that you're there in numbers. Make sure that they know that you mean business.
Thank you for that. I have another question for Dr. Jeffries Leonard. What are some of the gun safety measures you've worked on, are working on in the House?
Well, we as an organization are a 501c3 on our foundation side and a 501c4, but we feel that gun safety measures are critically important for all the reasons that all of the panelists have stated here today. But I can certainly say that we have tried to do as an organization our due diligence to really support the legislation that Congresswoman McBath has talked about today. We have challenged our members, as the Congresswoman said. Nobody's going to pay attention unless your voice is heard. And so we have challenged our members to send letters, call, let your representatives know that this legislation is very important to you. And so we have worked on supporting the Police and Justicing Act. I know that the Bipartisan Background Check Act of 2019 that has passed the House, and then enhanced background check that is sitting in the Senate. We have encouraged our members to make sure that your voice is heard on this. Send your letters, call Senator McConnell and let him know that there's no reason that this should still sit, because there is power in numbers. And one of the things that I think is so important around our organization, we absolutely partner with other organizations to make sure that the collective voice is heard. When you talk about the power of Black women, we know what that looks like. Just ask, Doug Jones down in Alabama. He knows what that looks like. So we really have to ensure that as a collective. So I'm challenging everyone who's listening on this Facebook Live. Write your letters, make your calls. Don't let them think that because we're in the middle of a pandemic, because Ruth Bader Ginsburg has passed, because other things are happening, that this is something that has fallen by the wayside to us. Gun deaths are public health issues. Our children, our men, our women, our community is getting is being killed at much higher rates than anyone else. Let them know that this remains a top issue for us. And what we have done is to mobilize, galvanize, partner to ensure that our voice continues to get out there on this.
Absolutely. We have to keep our voice out up front. And I have another question for Mrs. Smith. Smith, right now, what does gun control, let me rephrase the question. What influence does the National Rifle Association, known as NRA, have on gun control?
I was on mute, excuse me. I think Congresswoman McBath really said it all. You can only speculate, but when she talks about the culture that we're in and the symbiotic relationship that the organization has with individuals and those that they support, changing culture is tough. It is not by chance that we're in a situation where they have such large influence. They have an incredible influence. They have been working on that for years and years, subliminally changing the landscape of what the Second Amendment meant. And it's tough to change a culture, and you're not talking a small shift in the culture. You really are talking a very large shift. The average citizen who is appalled by what happens with gun violence and where we are has to speak up so that and change the influence and the power that those have it. Until they hurt, until they feel as though there is some pressure, real pressure put on them at the ballot box in terms of money that's paid out for different things, political influence. We do have to have the right seat at the table to represent us. Shirley Chisholm always said, if they don't give you a seat at the table, full of a folding chair. Congresswoman McBath and many others have pulled up that folding chair, but it's going to take more of us to make sure that we're running for office and sitting in those seats and having that influence and being seen on a regular basis. We have to chase the landscape of what the legislative scene looks like. We have to change the landscape of those who support the Second Amendment looks like in terms of what it is they're supporting. We have to change the landscape in our communities of what we'll put up with from police departments, of what local legislation can look like, until we effectively start to make those changes by speaking up, by, as I said, being present, by sitting in those seats of power, then we will not be able to make the kind of difference that we need to make. We cannot just talk about it. Forms are important and education is important, but we have to actively engage as a part of that solution, like Congresswoman McBath and others are doing in order for that change to happen. NRA is incredible. I'm impressed. They do a phenomenal job. We got to be just as impressed with ourselves and figure out how they do it and shift and pivot to make sure we're doing the same thing and using some of those same tactics.
Absolutely. I want to give this last question to Congresswoman McBath. What does gun control really look like? Raising legal age, ban on automatic weapons, etc. What are practical solutions? And basically, what can we do?
Thank you for that question. As I said, just a little bit earlier, there's not really one specific policy that's going to end gun violence. It's going to take many, many pieces of policy passed, state and local, and also federal, but it's going to take that much effort to dramatically reduce the gun violence that we're living with right now. I am proud to have sponsored legislation in the House for universal background checks for all gun sales. I know there are other of my colleagues also that will be putting forth legislation. I can guarantee you that this, of course, everything is equally important to me that I champion every single day on the Hill, but this I know I will live the rest of my life trying to make sure that we eradicate this unnecessary gun violence. I will tell you that the NRA gun lobby spent over almost $50 million putting President Trump in office. They have a seat at the table in the White House.
Mhm.
And so they are not going to lie down easily. They are not going to lie down easily, and they're going to fight to the very end to be able to espouse that the Second Amendment gives them the ability to be able to use their guns however they want, wherever they want, even if they choose to be a vigilante, which the Second Amendment does not allow them to do that. With the Second Amendment, which I think everyone here said we all agree, we support it, but we have to make sure that the ways in which people are using their guns, that there is a sense of common sense and purpose and safety placed in those measures, in the ways in which people are being allowed to use their guns. We've got to continue to make sure that we're pounding on the Senate and Mitch McConnell, making sure that we are really pushing them to do what is right. Anytime you change a culture, and we're now talking about changing the culture of guns, and may I please say this, the terminology is really gun violence prevention. Because when you say gun control, if you're trying to change the mind of an existing gun owner, all they hear is control and they shut you down. So what this is saving lives. It's gun violence prevention. But you know, in order to do that, we have to be able to get their attention. And in order to do that, that means we have to be louder than the gun lobby. We have to be louder than those that would espouse that they can use their guns any way that they want. And that is how you dramatically change and shift the entire culture. We've got to be invested, we've got to be engaged, and we've got to be intentional in what we do on the state and local level and in our communities to keep our communities safe.
Thank you so much. I think we can be intentional starting now with changing and shifting, now saying gun violence prevention. We can show up at the polls, the local polls, this September 29th and vote. Thank you all so much. As we move into our call to action with Sherry Stone, National Public Policy Committee Chair and member of the Prince William County community.
So good evening, ladies. You've heard a common theme throughout our panel discussion this evening. Let your voice be heard. Now it's your turn to be able to let your voice be heard in our call to action. The National Coalition of 100 Black Women advocates on behalf of Black women and girls. Through advocacy, we work as change agents to influence policy that promotes gender equity in health, education, economic, and political empowerment. We advocate completion of the 2020 census by September the 30th. The census determines the number of congressional representatives and state districting for future voting. Remember, it is the legislative branch that makes the laws. We advocate voting. Register to vote. Vote early to avoid mail delays, poll lines. Please vote. Vote the complete ballot. Remember, there are three branches of the government. The executive is the president, the legislative, Congress, our lawmakers, and we have the judicial branch, the Supreme Court. The current administration has appointed 2 Supreme Court justices and nearly 200 other justices with lifetime appointments to lower federal courts. These individuals will interpret the law for the rest of their lives. To complete the 2020 census, go to www.vote.org. You can register to vote. You can complete the census. You can check your ballot to see your polling place to see where you vote. You can request a ballot all at that one location. Become a poll worker. Volunteer to vote. Volunteer to work the poll. Because of the pandemic, we will have limited number of individuals across the nation. Volunteer. Let your service be heard and seen. We advocate for legislation by reaching out to federal, state, and local legislators. Communicate your views on gun safety and gun control. Ask your legislator directly to vote in a way that supports your interests. The Breonna Taylor law will ban no-knock search warrants if passed. Know your federal, state, and local representatives to advocate on your behalf. Share your legislative issues and concerns with your legislators by writing a letter, sending an email. Let your voice be heard. Thank you.
As we reflect on the information we just heard, it is imperative that we start to seek out solution and the leaders that are creating change we wish to see. It is up to us to continue the conversation. We do not need to lose any more lives due to the careless decision of Congress. As we continue to advocate for our communities, we need to advocate for their health and safety as well. We must demand changes. I'd like to thank our panelists, Congresswoman Lucy McBath, National Presidents Beverly Smith and Dr. Kimberly Jeffrey Linden, for sharing your story and spreading light on an issue that affects us all. Thank you, Dr. Phillips, for moderating the conversation tonight. I'd like to thank First Vice President Sarita Tinsley and the public policy team, Sharon Stone, Mariko Bennett, for your insight. And thank you, Serenity, for sharing with us your perspective for our future. And Afrida Stuk, thank you very much. And Bridget Baker, thank you for producing this town hall meeting for us tonight. And I'd like to say good night to everyone. Thank you.